The sound of my wife's pearls hitting the marble floor of the Mount Washington ballroom is something I will never forget. 220 guests fell silent as those little white beads scattered across the dance floor like teeth knocked loose from a mouth. My son-in-law had just shoved me into a banquet table to rip the necklace out of my hand. He was not drunk. He was not confused. He wanted the deed to my beach house in Wellfleet, and he was willing to break the last piece I had left of my late wife to get it. I did not yell. I did not swing back. I walked out of that ballroom in my torn tuxedo jacket, sat in the parking lot of the most beautiful hotel in New Hampshire, and made one phone call. 40 minutes later, when the doors of that ballroom opened again, it was not a paramedic and it was not the police. It was a woman in a charcoal suit holding a leather portfolio, and the moment my daughter saw her face, she dropped her glass of champagne and started to cry. But to understand why I had to burn my only daughter's wedding to the ground to get my dignity back, you have to understand what happened in the 90 seconds before that shove. My name is not important, but I will tell you anyway. I am 67 years old. I built a chain of luxury automobile dealerships across New England, starting with a single Cadillac showroom my father left me in 1981 and ending with 12 locations from Portland to Greenwich. I paid for my daughter to go to Wellesley. I paid for her graduate school at Tufts. I paid for the engagement ring my son-in-law put on her finger because he could not afford a real diamond on a junior associate's salary. And on the night of August 4th, I wrote a check for $190,000 to throw her a wedding at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, the same hotel where my wife and I had spent our honeymoon 41 years earlier. My wife passed away 3 winters ago, breast cancer. She fought it for 2 years and lost in a hospital bed in Boston, and the only thing she asked me before she went was that I keep the beach house in Wellfleet exactly the way she left it. Her gardening boots were still by the back door. Her books were still on the nightstand. Her wedding dress was still in the cedar closet upstairs. That house was not a piece of real estate. It was a grave with windows and a porch swing. I was standing near the bar, holding a tumbler of bourbon I had no intention of drinking, watching my daughter dance with her new husband to a song my wife used to hum while she cooked Sunday dinners. The Mount Washington ballroom looked like something out of a fairy tale that night. White hydrangeas imported from Holland filled every centerpiece. The chandeliers above us were original, hand-restored, dripping with crystal from another century. The band was a 12-piece outfit from Boston that I had personally selected because my wife loved big band music. I had spent the entire day reminding myself to be happy, to smile, to give my daughter the wedding her mother would have wanted. I was succeeding, more or less, until my son-in-law tapped his glass with a butter knife and called the room to attention for what he announced would be a special toast to the father of the bride. He walked over to me with that smug confidence I had always disliked. He had a way of moving through rooms as if he owned them, even rooms where he was a guest. He stopped about 3 feet in front of me, raised his glass, and asked the band to lower the music. 220 pairs of eyes turned toward us. He smiled at the crowd, then leaned in close enough that I could smell the gin on his breath, and he said something that froze the blood in my hands. He told me, quietly, that his parents would be moving into the Wellfleet house on Monday morning, and he was going to need the deed by the end of the reception. He said it like he was asking for a refill. He said it like he was already decided. I thought I had misheard him. I asked him to repeat himself. He smiled wider, took a sip of his drink, and explained that his folks had recently sold their place in Hartford, and the timing had not worked out with their next purchase, and the beach house was just sitting there empty most of the year anyway, and my daughter had told him it would be no problem. My daughter had told him. I looked across the room, and there she was. My only child, the girl whose forehead I used to kiss before bed, watching us from beside the cake table with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was not nervous. It was not embarrassed. It was not embarrassed. It was patient. She was waiting for me to do what she had told him I would do. I told him no. I said it quietly because I did not want to ruin her night. I told him that the house in Wellfleet was not on the table. Not for him, not for his parents, not for anyone. I told him I had booked his parents a beautiful suite at the Wentworth in Portsmouth for the rest of the weekend on my dime, and that was the extent of my generosity. I told him my late wife's belongings were still in that house, and they were not going anywhere. His face changed. I watched it happen in real time. The polite groom mask slid off, and underneath was the man my daughter had actually married. He stepped closer. He pointed a finger in my face. He told me, loud enough for the first 10 rows of guests to hear, that I was a selfish old man hoarding a beach house I did not even use. He told me my dead wife was not coming back and it was time to stop acting like a museum curator. And then he reached out and grabbed the strand of pearls I had been holding in my left hand all evening. The pearls my wife had been wearing the day I proposed. The pearls she had asked me to give to our daughter on her wedding day, which was what I had been planning to do during the father-daughter dance, in private, the way my wife had wanted. When he yanked the pearls, I pulled back. It was instinct. He was stronger than me, and he was angry, and when I refused to let go, he shoved me hard with his free hand. I lost my balance. My hip hit the corner of a banquet table. A water pitcher tipped over. The strand snapped. Pearls went everywhere. The music stopped on a half note as the drummer realized something had gone wrong. 220 heads turned in unison. The silence was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. I stood there with my hand braced on the table, my jacket torn at the lapel, looking at the man my daughter had just married. He was still holding what was left of the necklace, a broken string with maybe a dozen pearls clinging to it. His face was flushed. He was breathing through his nose like a bull. I waited for someone to do something. I waited for my daughter to run over and ask if I was okay. I waited for my brother, her uncle, who was sitting at table 6, to stand up and put a hand on this kid's shoulder. Nobody moved. The silence stretched on and on. And then my daughter walked across the dance floor in her wedding dress, past the scattered pearls, and stood next to her husband. She put her hand on his arm. She turned to me, and she said in front of all those people that she could not believe I would do this on her wedding day. She said I was always like this. She said I had ruined her engagement party 2 years ago, and now I was ruining her wedding. She said her mother would be ashamed. That last line was the one that did it. Something inside me went very quiet and very still. I have negotiated buyouts with hostile boards. I have fired men who had worked for me for 20 years. I have watched my wife die. I am familiar with the moment when the temperature in your chest drops below freezing and you stop feeling anything at all. I felt it then. I straightened up. I let go of the table. I looked at my daughter and I told her calmly that I needed some air. I bent down. I picked up one pearl from the floor. Just one. I put it in my pocket. I walked through the crowd. The crowd parted for me. I could feel them staring. I could hear the whispers starting before I even reached the door. I did not look back. The valet brought my car. I sat in the driver's seat of my old Lincoln, the same model I've been driving for 9 years because my wife had picked it out. And I looked at my hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, from rage. I felt my phone in my breast pocket, and I pulled it out. I scrolled past my daughter's number. I scrolled past my brother's number. I scrolled past every friend I had made in 40 years of business. I stopped on a name that almost nobody outside my company knew. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. She always answers on the second ring. She always answers on the second ring, no matter the hour. I asked her where she was. She told me she was at her place in Concord working on a brief. I told her I needed her at the Mount Washington Hotel in 2 hours and I needed her to bring everything. She did not ask what everything meant. She did not ask what everything meant. She asked one question. She asked if anyone had put hands on me. I told her yes. There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted maybe 4 seconds, and when she spoke again, her voice had a quality to it I had only ever heard her use in courtrooms. She told me to stay in my car. She told me she was leaving in 5 minutes. She told me she would call ahead and have a state trooper escort her up the mountain. And then she said something that almost made me smile for the first time all night. She said, "Activate the family clause." And I told her, "It is activated. Bring the hammer." She hung up. The family clause was something my general counsel had insisted on the day after I buried my wife. She had sat me down in my office and told me, gently but firmly, that grief made people reckless and grief made vultures bold. She had drafted a clause that gave me, as the founder and sole controlling shareholder, the unilateral right to claw back every employment contract, freeze every credit line, and revoke every housing arrangement extended to a family member, effective immediately, in the event of any qualifying breach of trust. Physical assault was a qualifying breach. Conspiracy to defraud the founder was a qualifying breach. I had signed it and put it in a drawer and prayed I would never need it. I had needed it now. While I waited for her to arrive, I did something I had been meaning to do for 2 years and never gotten around to. I opened the security app on my phone, the one that connected to the cameras at the Wellfleet house. I had installed the cameras after a break-in scare in town the previous summer. I never checked them. I tapped the icon and waited for the feed to load. What I saw made the blood leave my face. Every light in the house was on. The driveway, which should have been empty, had 3 cars in it. I recognized the silver Mercedes that belonged to my son-in-law's father. I recognized the ridiculous orange Camaro his younger brother drove. There was a third car I did not recognize, a U-Haul cargo van with the back doors open. I switched cameras to the living room. My son-in-law's mother was in there, on her hands and knees, going through the cabinet under the bookshelves where my wife kept her record collection. She had a cardboard box next to her, and she was loading my wife's records into it. The good ones, the Ella Fitzgerald, the Sarah Vaughan, the Sinatra. Records my wife had collected since she was a teenager. I switched cameras to the bedroom. My son-in-law's father was sitting on my wife's side of the bed, with his shoes on, going through the jewelry box on her vanity. He was holding her engagement ring up to the light, the ring I had bought her in 1983 with 3 months of dealership commissions, the ring she had taken off only twice in her life, once to scrub the kitchen tile, once when the chemotherapy made her fingers too thin. He held it up, turned it, and then slipped it into his shirt pocket. I switched cameras to the kitchen. My son-in-law's brother was at the refrigerator, drinking directly from a bottle of the Krug champagne. My wife and I had been saving for our 45th anniversary, which would have been this December. He was drinking it from the bottle and laughing. I sat in my car and I watched my dead wife's life being looted in real time by 3 strangers who had been invited to my daughter's wedding earlier that day. They had eaten the canapes I paid for, and then driven 290 miles to my beach house to clean it out before the reception was even over. My son-in-law had clearly given them the alarm code. My daughter had clearly told them to be done by midnight. The shove and the demand for the deed had been a formality, a piece of theater. They had assumed I would cave at the wedding, hand over the keys, and they would have the place legally by morning. The deed transfer was supposed to be a clean coda to a job already half done. I recorded every second of it. I sent the footage to 3 different cloud accounts and 1 email address that belonged to my general counsel. I made sure the timestamps were locked. Then I leaned back in my seat and I let myself feel it for a moment. Not the anger. The grief. My daughter had known. My daughter had signed off on this. My daughter had stood next to a man who had just put his hands on her father, and she had told that father in front of his closest friends that her dead mother would be ashamed of him. My daughter had become a stranger, and I had not noticed because I had been too busy missing my wife to look at what was happening right in front of me. My phone buzzed. I looked at it. It was my daughter. I let it ring. It buzzed again. A text message. She wrote that I was embarrassing her. She wrote that her husband was furious. She wrote that I needed to come back inside and apologize. She wrote that we could discuss the house later, but right now I was ruining the most important day of her life. I read the messages twice. I did not respond. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat. A minute later, my son-in-law called. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I picked up on the third try because I wanted to hear what he sounded like when he thought he was winning. He was slurring. He had clearly had more to drink in the last 15 minutes. He told me I had two choices. I could come back in and sign the deed transfer his lawyer had drafted, which was sitting in an envelope on the gift table, and we would all forget this little misunderstanding, or I could refuse, and on Monday morning, he would file a petition for conservatorship with the Suffolk County Probate Court on the grounds that I was a danger to myself, that I had been forgetting appointments, that I had been hostile to family members, and that I was hoarding assets in a manner consistent with early-stage dementia. He told me he had already spoken to a doctor. He told me my daughter had already signed a sworn affidavit attesting to my decline. He told me that by Thanksgiving, he and my daughter would have power of attorney over every asset I owned, and they would be selling the Wellfleet house, the Beacon Hill condo, and probably the dealership on Boylston, too, because honestly, I was getting too old to run that thing anyway. I listened to him talk. I let him finish. And then I asked him one question. I asked him whether my daughter had actually signed an affidavit or whether he was bluffing. He laughed. He told me to come back inside and ask her myself. I told him I would do exactly that, and I hung up. I made one more call before my general counsel arrived. I called the chief financial officer of my company. I woke him up. I told him to pull every transaction on 3 corporate cards over the last 18 months. The card issued to my daughter, who worked as a junior executive in our marketing department. The card issued to my son-in-law, who had been given a no-show consulting contract as a wedding gift from me 6 months ago. And the card issued to my son-in-law's father, who, I now recalled, had been added as an authorized user for vendor entertainment purposes at my daughter's suggestion last spring. My CFO told me to give him 20 minutes. I told him I had 20. The headlights came up the long drive of the Mount Washington at 11:47. 3 black SUVs in a tight formation, all with the same out-of-state plates. They pulled up in a perfect line in front of the main entrance, ignoring the valets, ignoring the no parking signs. The lead vehicle's door opened and my general counsel stepped out. She was 58 years old. She was wearing a charcoal suit that had been tailored for her in London. She had a leather portfolio in one hand and a thick manila envelope in the other. Behind her came 2 paralegals, 2 former Boston PD officers. I kept on retainer for executive protection, and a man I did not recognize who turned out to be the local sheriff's deputy she had called from the road. She walked over to my car. I rolled down the window. She looked at the tear in my jacket, at the red mark on the side of my face where I had hit the table, and at my hand, which was scraped and bleeding from grabbing the tablecloth. She did not say a word. She just nodded once, sharply, and gestured for me to get out. I did. I buttoned what was left of my jacket. She handed me a fresh pocket square from her portfolio because, of course, she had brought one. I tucked it in. We walked together up the marble steps of the hotel. The doorman saw us coming, saw the size of the men behind us, and held the door open without asking any questions. We crossed the lobby. We walked down the long hallway toward the ballroom. I could hear the band playing again. They had started up again 20 minutes after I left, which somehow made me angrier than anything else that had happened that night. She stopped me outside the ballroom doors. She handed me the envelope. She told me to open it when I was ready. She told me that the family clause had been executed at 9:57, that my daughter's employment had been terminated at 10:02, that the corporate cards had been killed at 10:04, that the no-show consulting contract had been voided at 10:06, and that the eviction notice for the Wellfleet Beach house where my son-in-law's parents were currently looting my wife's belongings had been filed with the Barnstable County Sheriff at 10:15. A cruiser was already on the property. My in-laws by marriage were already in handcuffs. The Krug champagne and the engagement ring had already been recovered as stolen property. She told me all of this in less than 30 seconds. Then she opened the door. I will not pretend the moment I walked back into that ballroom was not satisfying. It was. The band stopped mid-song again, for the second time that night. People who had been gossiping about me for the last hour suddenly went silent. I saw faces from the dealership, faces from the country club, faces from my church, all turning toward me with that horrible mixture of pity and curiosity that people wear at funerals. I ignored them. I walked down the center of the dance floor. My son-in-law was at the head table. He was leaning back in his chair with one arm slung over the back of my daughter's chair. He looked up. He saw me. He saw the woman next to me. The smirk on his face slid off so fast I almost laughed. My general counsel did not waste time. She walked up to the bandstand, took the microphone from the bandleader, and tapped it once. The sound system carried the tap through the entire ballroom. She introduced herself by name and title. She announced that she was there in her capacity as general counsel for the corporation, and that she had been authorized by the founder and majority shareholder to make a brief announcement that would clarify the financial arrangements for the evening. She did it cleanly. Surgically, she informed the room that effective at approximately 10:04 that evening, 2 corporate credit cards had been deactivated. She named the card holders. She paused. She informed the hotel's banquet manager, who was standing white-faced near the kitchen doors, that the corporate authorization originally provided for the balance of tonight's reception had been formally rescinded, and that the remaining $112,000 on the tab would not be honored. The room made a sound I cannot describe. It was somewhere between a gasp and a moan. 220 people doing math in their heads at the same time. She continued. She informed the room that the no-show consulting contract that had been extended to a member of the wedding party as a wedding gift had been terminated for cause, with cause being conspiracy to commit fraud and grand larceny in concert with members of the contracting party's immediate family. She informed the room that my daughter's employment at the corporation, which had begun in 2018, had been terminated effective an hour and 40 minutes ago, also for cause. She did not specify the cause in front of the guests, which was a kindness my daughter did not deserve. And then she said the line that finished it. She turned to my son-in-law and she said very calmly that the Barnstable County Sheriff's Department had taken his mother, his father, and his younger brother into custody approximately 20 minutes ago at a residence in Wellfleet on charges of breaking and entering grand larceny and trespass. She told him his mother had been wearing my late wife's mink coat when they put her in the cruiser. She told him his father had been found with my late wife's engagement ring in his shirt pocket. She told him his brother had vomited cruise champagne onto the front steps of the house while being arrested. She told him all of this in front of 220 people, and she did it in the same calm, professional voice my late wife used to use when she was reading to school children. My son-in-law did not say anything for a moment. He looked like a man who had been hit by a bus and was still trying to figure out whether he was alive. Then he stood up. He started shouting. He told the room that I was lying, that my general counsel was lying, that this was all a misunderstanding. He demanded to know who had given the order. My general counsel pointed at me without looking away from him. He turned. He saw me at the foot of the dance floor. He saw my torn jacket. He saw the pearl in my hand, the one I had picked up off the floor an hour ago. He charged at me. He got 3 steps before my 2 former Boston PD officers stepped in front of him. They did not touch him. They just stood there. He stopped. He started screaming about how I was destroying his life, about how my daughter was going to divorce me, about how I would never see my grandchildren. I almost pointed out that he did not have any children yet. I let him scream. My daughter stood up at the head table. I watched her face go through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds. The last one, the one that stuck, was fear. Pure animal fear. The fear of a person who has just realized she has chained herself to a corpse. She looked at her husband. She looked at me. She looked at her husband again. She started walking toward me, hands out, mouth opening to start whatever speech she had been mentally drafting since the announcement began. I held up my hand. She stopped. I took the microphone from my general counsel. I looked at my daughter. I asked her, in front of all those people, whether she had signed an affidavit attesting that her father was suffering from cognitive decline. I asked it slowly. I asked it clearly. I gave her every opportunity to say no. She did not answer at first. She looked at her husband. He shook his head. She looked back at me. She started crying. And in that crying, which I knew was not for me, I had my answer. I told her I loved her. I told her that I had loved her every single day since the morning she was born. I told her that her mother had loved her more than her own life, which was a thing I had personally witnessed for 30 years. I told her that the love did not go away just because I was about to do what I was about to do. And then I told her that she was no longer welcome in my home. Either home. I told her that the trust her mother and I had set up for her, the one that was supposed to fund her future and the future of her children, had been frozen pending the outcome of a fraud investigation. I told her that her name had been removed from the deed to the Wellfleet house, which had been done 6 months ago at her mother's posthumous instruction, which she did not know about because she had stopped reading her mother's letters from hospice. I told her that I was not going to press charges against her personally because she was my daughter, but I was going to press charges against her husband, his parents, and his brother, and I was going to make sure those charges stuck. She started shaking. She tried to come closer. The officers stepped between us, not because I had told them to, but because they understood what was happening better than I did. She turned to her husband. She started screaming at him. She called him names I would not repeat. She told him he had ruined her life. She told him she wanted an annulment. She tore the wedding ring off her finger and threw it at him. It missed him. It hit a waiter, who caught it on reflex like a baseball. I handed the microphone back to my general counsel. I walked out of the ballroom for the second time that night. This time I was not alone. I had my counsel on one side and a sheriff's deputy on the other and 2 former cops behind me, and I was not the embarrassed old man in the torn jacket anymore. I was something else. I do not know what to call it. But it did not feel like grief. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding. My son-in-law's parents pled out. They got 18 months each, suspended, with restitution and probation. My son-in-law's brother got 6 months in a county facility because of a prior conviction for check fraud. My son-in-law himself is awaiting trial on charges of conspiracy and assault, and his public defender is trying to get the assault dropped because the security footage from the Mount Washington only caught the shove from the side, not the moment my hip hit the table. We will see. My daughter filed for annulment 2 days after the wedding. She moved out of the apartment they had been renting and went to stay with my brother, her uncle, who has more patience for her than I do right now. She has called me 11 times. I have not answered. I do not know if I ever will. I do not know if that makes me a bad father or a good one. Maybe it makes me both. The Wellfleet house is being cleaned and restored. The records are back on the shelf. The engagement ring is in a safe deposit box at my bank in Boston because I cannot yet decide what to do with it. The cedar closet upstairs is still closed. I have not been able to open it. What I have done is signed paperwork yesterday morning to establish a music scholarship in my wife's name at the Berklee College of Music, where she studied for 2 years before she met me and decided to teach kids instead of becoming a concert pianist. The endowment is funded entirely by the assets that had been earmarked for my daughter's inheritance. 42 students a year for the next 20 years will be able to attend Berklee tuition-free because of money my daughter will never see. I had to make peace with that. I think I have. I drove down to Wellfleet last weekend. I sat on the porch swing for an hour. I held the single pearl I picked up off the ballroom floor that night, the one I keep in my pocket now. And I talked to my wife the way I used to talk to her on that porch when she was sick. I told her what our daughter had done. I told her what I had done. I asked her if I had been too hard. The wind came off the water and moved the chimes by the kitchen window, the chimes she had hung there in 1996, and that was the only answer I got. I will take it. After everything, it was enough.